Good morning. I can remember what seems like 100 years ago. I was working at a church, First Presbyterian Church in Lancaster, Ohio, and I had some close connections with an organization called the, give me a second here, not Pittsburgh Youth, it was Ruth, I used to speak all across remember I used to go there? Youth Specialties, thank you. Don't ever get old, because this is what happens to you. So in any case, I used to speak all across the country about youth ministry, various cities. And this one year I was in San Diego, which is like, California is not my favorite state, but if I had to live in California, it would be San Diego. It's a beautiful place. And I can remember I was towards the end of my tenure there at First Pres. I'd been there for 8 years. This was probably like my 7th year. And I was restless. And I can remember getting ready for this seminar. There were going to be about 600 people there. And so I went into the restroom to make sure that, I had no flyaway hairs or, my shirt was tucked in and all that kind of stuff. And I looked in the mirror. I was just sort of struck by it, but I looked in the mirror and I found myself saying to myself, "Who are you and what are you doing here? Who are you and what are you doing here?" I spent a lot of years doing youth ministry. We had a very successful program where I was at First Pres. It was one of the top programs and top 3% of the programs in the country. It was a great program. Wonderful people, great church. And overall, I loved it, but something else was moving in me, and I knew that I needed to make a change. And so after I got home from that, I began to make plans to go to seminary, get my master's degree, which meant moving back here. So I went to Trinity in Ambridge. And I can remember just sort of entering into that learning ethos, just that place where for the first time I had almost unbridled access to information, to knowledge about the Bible, about God that I'd never been exposed to before. And there were times, I kid you not, there were times when I would wake up and my head would be swirling with just information and joy, fascination, with just whole new things that I became aware of that made sense to me, that just gave me a much more clearer picture of who God was and what He required. So that initial question of who are you and what are you doing here was a very important question as I looked at myself, looked at my eyes in that mirror, and I had to come to terms with what my purpose was in life. And so after I got my master's degree, then I started teaching at Geneva College. And again, I mean, my experience there was I just loved it. I loved being with students. I loved teaching. I loved hanging out with them. I loved the small groups that I did. I loved the trips that we took with them. I loved the one-on-ones, the mentoring work that I spent hours and hours and hours, and over the course of the time that I was, hundreds and hundreds of students. Loved it. And I felt as if that because I asked that initial question, I entered into a stage, a phase in my life. And so because I was there, I acquired even more knowledge, even more hunger for knowledge and stuff. And so I went on and I got my doctoral degree. And it was the same experience. And it just gave me even a deeper and more profound understanding of not only who God was, but how to study who God was and what God required of me. And so I would say, and this is so strange, and maybe some of you can relate to this, that you spend at least maybe half your life. So there's this quote that says, most people spend most of their lives indefinitely preparing to live. Most people spend most of their lives indefinitely preparing to live because they're just not sure who they are and what they're supposed to be doing. So I'm going to embarrass Wendy a little bit, but one of the things that I've observed in her is that once, and this, Wendy, you tell me if I'm wrong here, but this is my observation of you as a fairly new person, is that once you retired, you entered into what you would call an advocation, where now you just love to do crafts. You just love, because you couldn't do any of those things before. And now you feel as if you found a certain part of yourself that could not be there before. Is that fair? And many of us goes through that in life, you know. And not only do we do that, I think sometimes as people, but I think we even do that sometimes as institutions. That the role and the purpose of some institutions, like a church, for example, can change. It's always about Christ. It's always about the centrality of Christ. But how that happens, the message is eternal. The message always stays the same. The application, how we get that message to people, does change. It does change. But the institution itself cannot change unless the people inside that institution change. Unless they are sure about why they exist, what the purpose is, and how it is that they are supposed to do what it is that they're supposed to do. So I want to spend some time this morning with you on this person named Elijah. And many of you are familiar with him if you've read the Old Testament. Even a cursory reading of the Old Testament, you would know that Elijah is a fairly prominent figure in the Old Testament, and that there are some pretty amazing stories about him. But I want to begin with Matthew 17, verses 1 through 13. And I want to reread it because this was our gospel reading, I think, this morning. And I want to reread it to help set the stage about what I want to talk about in light of this. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Peter was an independent agent. James and John were brothers. They were the sons of thunder. They had distinguished themselves. They were part of the inner circle of Jesus. So I don't know if you know this, but there's this kind of concentric circle thing with Jesus. So he had the large crowds that followed him. Then he had the 120 who were in the upper room when he appeared and talked to them. Then he had the 70 that he sent out to drive out demons and heal and things like that. Then he had the 12 who were kind of like they were like the ones he spent all the time with. And then there were the 3, Peter, James, and John. They were the closest. And then there was John, who was closest. I mean, when you read in the Gospel of John, John always describes himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's how John always referred himself. So you have these kind of concentric circles. And so that's what's going on here. So he takes with him this very small group, his best buddies, and he goes and he says, there he was on this high mountain, there he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Now, in the Old Testament, anytime God revealed himself in this kind of a way, the Jews, and this is an extra biblical description, but I think it's an apt extra biblical description, the Jews would describe this as the Shekinah glory. God made manifest in splendor is what it means. God made present. God made manifest in splendor. Here was Jesus, the Shekinah glory, imitating what had taken place in the Old Testament. So there he was transfigured before him. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. So something big was happening here. Really big. Just then 3 appeared before them. Moses, Elijah, talking with Jesus. Just then there appeared before them Moses, Elijah, talking with Jesus. So they're watching Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah, and Jesus is transfigured on the top of this mountain as he's talking with these people who have gone on long before him. Moses like 1,500 years before, and Elijah like 800 years before. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," sort of like imitating the festival of the festival of lights or tabernacles. And so Peter spoke poorly here because basically he was saying, I'm going to put up 3 tents or tabernacles, and you all have equal standing, which was not the case. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord," and so while he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Those are the same exact words that were spoken when Jesus was baptized in the Gospel of John. So, when Jesus was baptized, "This is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Those are the same exact words. When Jesus was transfigured, these same words came from God the Father as well. When the disciples heard this, that is the voice, they fell down to the ground terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." So I'll just stop here in terms of that. Now, I need to go on for just a second. Verse 10. The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." The disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. But anytime I've read about the Mount of Transfiguration, I always wondered, now Moses made sense to me. I mean, Moses is this like very huge, powerful, highly influential figure upon which the whole of the Old Testament law, the escape from Egypt into the land of the promise, I mean, it was just, that made sense to me. But Elijah just seemed to me like an add-on. I never really fully appreciated about why Elijah was included in the Mount of Transfiguration. Why Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration? And so the quick kind of definition is this. Moses and Elijah represent the law and the prophets which witness to Jesus as the Messiah, the one who fulfills the Old Testament. Elijah was considered the prophetic forerunner of the Messiah. So that's kind of like the scholarly, technical description about why Elijah came. And there's a lot more that could be said, but I'll leave it at that. But I do want to talk about what made Elijah great enough to be included in the Mount of Transfiguration and how that has something to do with who we are and what we're about. I want to take a deep dive into the person and work of the Old Testament prophet Elijah. So his name in and of itself means Yahweh is God. That's what Elijah means. Yahweh is God. So the word Yahweh by the Jews during the time of Jesus was considered to be so holy that they never said it. In fact, they didn't even spell it out. They didn't use vowels. They only used consonants. But modern-day scholars believe that it was spelled in this way. Yahweh is God. In your King James Version, you'll see Jehovah, right? And maybe some of the others. But in the ESV, New American Standard, I think, NIV, it's Yahweh. It's how we explain it. I want to give to you a little bit of Elijah's historical context, because this is really important about understanding who he is and what his purpose was. He was a 9th century prophet. Not much is known about his earlier life. In fact, nothing is known about his early life. He was Elijah the Tishbite. That's all we know. In fact, I'll say this. He kind of comes onto the scene almost like Melchizedek does. If you know who Melchizedek is in the book of Genesis, this enigmatic figure, this priest from Salem, which later became Jerusalem. So he just appears. And in his time, his protagonists were primarily King Ahab and his queen Jezebel, who were of the Omrid dynasty. So you know that once a king became a king, he would have children, and they would have children, they would have children. They would call that a dynasty. And this was called the Omrid dynasty. His father was Omrid. And Jezebel was a Canaanite. And she was largely responsible for the systemic destruction of Yahweh worship, and she replaced it with Baal fertility worship. So she went throughout Israel trying to do whatever she could to destroy the worship of Yahweh and to replace it with the worship of Baal, who was a fertility god. So, and it would not be hard if I were to describe to you some of the things that Baal worship involved for it to sound downright pornographic. It was an evil religion. And fundamentally what they believed was that the more you imitated procreating, the more likely that Baal would bless you with rain and growth in terms of your crops and things like that. And that he was in control of the storm clouds, the sky, and those kinds of things. But Jezebel was a true believer in Baal. So much so that she tried her best to replace Yahwehism with the worship of Baal in every way that she could. And was not above, and the Israelites were not above practicing syncretism. Syncretism is the blending of religious faiths. So taking certain portions of Yahwehism and blending it with Baal. Talk about something that would be horrible to do. Things never change, do they? I mean, in what way, in principle, is this any different than what our modern day world tries to do with God? Right? How we try to blend religious faiths. I mean, I had a former student of mine who knows better. He received some of the most conservative Christian education on a college level that you could receive. And in the conversation I had with him a number of years ago, he said to me, as a believer, as a person who goes to church regularly, that God does not care who you sleep with and how. He's syncretized his faith with the secular order of things. So things rarely change. And it speaks to us and to our time. His ministry was primarily to the northern kingdom, that is Israel. So if you look at this map, if you can see it, you'll see in the red at the top, that is the northern kingdom, Israel. So at the time of Elijah, you had the divided kingdom, which took place in 922 BCE. Israel is in the north, and the capital was Samaria. Judah was in the south, the kingdom divided, and Judah was in the south. Elijah was a prophet for the northern kingdom under Ahab, and that was about 800 years before Christ. And then in the southern kingdom, Jerusalem was their capital. So Samaria in the north, Jerusalem in the south. Israel was destroyed in 722 BC by the Assyrians under Sargon II. And if you read how that took place, the utter destruction by the Assyrians was just gripping and tragic and horrible. because they refused to repent and to come back to Yahweh. Judah, the southern kingdom, was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586, about 136 years later by the Babylonians. So both kingdoms fell, and when they fell, people suffered terribly, and those who survived were carried off into different parts of the Assyrian kingdom, and then later on into the different parts of the Babylonian kingdom. They were completely dispersed. Now, Elijah's calling and mission had to do with intermarriage with Canaanites, worship and syncretism of false Canaanite fertility gods of Baal, confronting the toxic, corrupt, and injustice of the political establishment. Ahab was as corrupt as they come, politically speaking. Again, some things never change. Now, the remarkable uniqueness that make Elijah an absolutely towering figure in the Old and New Testament are as follows, and they are a model for all Christians. Now, I just want to note this. Of the Old Testament prophets who wrote books, we have 4 major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. None of those 4 appeared in the Mount of Transfiguration. They are considered major prophets because of the size of the books that they wrote or that were written about them. Then you have 12 minor prophets: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Again, none of those 12 minor prophets appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration, even though they either wrote books or books were written specifically about them. Elijah did not write a book, nor are there any books written in his name. But he still was the guy on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus and Moses. Now, surely that causes you to ask, why not these 4 or these 12? Why did Elijah show up and nobody else? He is prominently mentioned by only in 1 Kings chapter 17 through 19, chapter 21, and then in 2 Kings chapters 1 and 2, and in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 through 6. And this is what is said about him in Malachi, who wrote this about 400 years before the birth of Christ. 400 years after Elijah, 400 years before the birth of Christ. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. So we read then in that account in the Mount of Transfiguration where Jesus told the disciples, who was John the Baptist? He was the second coming of Elijah. Predicted here by Malachi 400 years before the birth of Christ. So my question again is, what made Elijah great enough to be included on the Mount of Transfiguration? Well, I have, I think, 8. And I think some of these are going to surprise you. He was one of only 2 people who almost saw the face of God from a cleft in a rock. Only Moses and only Elijah experienced the Shekinah glory where they almost saw the face of God. Moses saw the back of God as he passed by. When Elijah was in the cleft of the rock and God called him out, he covered his face so that he would not see the face of God. He was only one of 2 people who ever had that experience in terms of the Shekinah glory in that kind of a way. Only one of 2. Number 2. He was only one of 2 people who never died a natural death. Enoch didn't die, and Elijah didn't die a natural death. Only one of 2. Number 3. He was one of only 2 people of whom witnesses saw a bodily ascension. Now, he's in really good company here. So Elisha saw him ascend, and Jesus ascended during his last days here on earth. And there are 2 accounts of that. Only one of 2 people who ever had a bodily ascension. Number 4, he was one of only 2 people while in the wilderness under physical duress that were fed personally by angels. Again, he's in great company here. So angels ministered to him after Jezebel said that she was going to kill him. And Jesus was ministered to by angels after the 40 days of fasting in the wilderness. Only one of 2 who were ever tended to by angels and fed by angels under great physical duress. Number 5. He was only one of 4 people who miraculously multiplied bread. Moses did with manna in Exodus 16. Elijah did in chapter 17. Elisha, who was a disciple of Elijah's, who asked Elijah for a double portion of his spirit. So you almost got to connect the two. Elisha made some bread. And then Jesus, of course, in Matthew 14 and Mark 6. He's in a rarefied company here. Number 5. How about this? He was the first one in the Bible to raise somebody from the dead. Only one of 5 biblical leaders who did so. Elisha was who raised the son of the Shunammite woman. Jesus, who raised Lazarus, as well as some others. Peter, who raised Tabitha or Dorcas. And Paul, who raised Eutychus, who fell asleep in the window and fell out. That'll teach him for falling asleep during a sermon, right? Maybe he learned from that. But those were the only ones who ever raised someone from the dead. Again, that's pretty significant company, wouldn't you say? Jesus, Peter, Paul. Peter and Paul, long considered in the history of the church as being the 2 primary apostles of the church. Number 6. He was one of only a few people of the major figures in the Old Testament that had no known moral or spiritual failures. The only other person I can think of is Samuel. Number 7, he was the only Old Testament biblical figure predicted to return again. In Malachi. So, that's quite a resume, wouldn't you say? So when other people that you might put in front of Elijah, like why not David? Why not Abraham? Why weren't they on the Mount of Transfiguration? It was Elijah. And it was Elijah in part because of these reasons. But he wasn't on the Mount of Transfiguration for just those reasons. What really made Elijah great enough to be included on the Mount of Transfiguration was not just his multiple confrontations with the most powerful political figures of his time. It was not just his suffering and hardship in the wilderness on behalf of Yahweh. It was not just his miracles of multiplying bread and oil. It was not just the raising the dead son of the widow of Zarephath in chapter 17. It was not just his humiliating and dramatic defeat and destruction of the prophets of 700 prophets of Baal. It was not just that. It was not just him ending the drought of 3 years over the land of Israel. It was not because of his succor or relief, help from the angels in the wilderness. It was not his experience in viewing just the Shekinah glory. Those weren't the reasons why he was included just in the Mount of Transfiguration. What really made Elijah great enough to be included on the Mount of Transfiguration was his heart and response in the presence of Yahweh's Shekinah glory. Follow me. This is from 1 Kings 19, verses 9 through 18. Very dramatic, very powerful scene. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous." You can read zealous as that word. "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And God said to him, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in a cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous or zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus." And then further on down he says, "Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." And so Yahweh reassures him that he's not the only one, that there's still 7,000 people left who share his zealousness, his faithfulness, his determination. Why was Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration? More specifically, it's because of Yahweh's first question. What are you doing here, Elijah? He said, "I have been very jealous." That word kana, jealous or zealous, means that you have this incredibly embraced passion for something. It will not go away. It's rooted deeply inside of you. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed. He was on mission. He knew what his purpose was. And that zealousness was what enabled him to achieve the purpose for which God. And so we read here the very first question at the very beginning of the dialogue. This is the question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And then we read again in verse 13, towards the end of the dialogue, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" First question, last question. And the response by Elijah is the same. And that response was what qualified him to stand on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. It wasn't all the resume stuff. It was that heart. It was that response. It was that heart that enabled him to achieve the resume that I listed for you. It was that heart that he was zealous for the Lord. And it didn't matter if people were trying to kill him. It didn't matter if it seemed like nobody else was around. It didn't matter. He was going to remain true to who he was and what he had been called to. He was zealous for the Lord. Are we still certain of our purpose? Are we jealous or zealous for the Lord? Even when a maelstrom tears at our world and breaks it into pieces? Are we still certain of our purpose and zealous for the Lord? Even when the earthquakes in our life crack our foundations and collapse the important structures in our life, is that zealousness still there? Are we still certain of our purpose and zealous for the Lord when the fiery challenges in life threaten to incinerate all that we love? Does that zealousness go away, or does it stay? Even if it seems like we're the only one. Are we still certain of our purpose and zealous for the Lord, even when our life is full of alluring idols, gods and goddesses that appear as noble and good distractions? Most distractions that pull us away from our zealousness from the Lord are idols, and they are alluring. And the church is infected throughout because of them. We lack zealousness because of these kinds of distractions that we have in our life. Are we still certain of our purpose and jealousness, our jealousy or zealousness for the Lord, even when we are surrounded by choices between the good and the best? The enemy of the best is the good. The enemy of the good is what is mediocre. The enemy of the mediocre is what can be tolerated. And that's how the enemy works in our life. We lose our passion, we lose our zealousness because we lose our commitment to what is best. And what is best is Christ. I don't know if you know this, and so a lot of this has to do with hope, about how we go through life in terms of hope. The Greeks believed, the Greeks did not believe that hope was a virtue. They thought it was kind of stupid. Jews and Christians always connected hope with God. That whatever hope they had, it was connected with what God would do. Are we committed to what our hope is? Our hope committed to what God will do? And is there a zealousness, a passion, and a commitment to that? Are we still certain of our purpose and zealousness for the Lord when we are tempted to live and comport our lives before the tyranny of the urgent versus what is important? Because what is important is not always, what is urgent is not always what is important. In fact, we are terribly confused about all that. And we lose our zealousness for the Lord as a result of that. Learn from Elijah. See through the storms that threaten to shatter everything around you. Transcend the eruptions that shake your foundations to the core. Suffocate the fiery ordeals that burn through everyone's life. Many expect to see God work through cataclysmic drama, the wind, the earthquake, and fire. But most of the time, his work is quiet and imperceptible, like that of a whisper that we all need to be able to hear. Do you hear when God whispers to you? Do you hear him as he calls you back to your purpose that he has given to you for your life? Do you hear that whisper when he says, "Where is the zealousness for me that you once had?" Do you hear him say to you, "You can do more, you can be more, we can walk more closely"? In that whisper, usually when we get up in the morning, maybe before we go to bed at night, or when we hear something on the radio, or as we read the scriptures, that there's this call, this whisper for us to achieve more, to be more in the light of Christ. So let me ask you this, in the spirit of Elijah. What are you doing here, Christian? What are you doing here? What are you zealous for, really? What are you doing here, Christian? What is your life about? How do you array your talents and your skills and your abilities? How does all that speak and feed and point to Christ in our lives? Authentic zealousness for the Lord makes possible everything that Elijah did in his life and more. Jesus said, "You will do greater things than me." Than the miracles that he did, the teaching that he gave. And I understand, that we live in this world where things are obfuscated and unclear, and it's difficult to know what is true and not true, and where we are tempted in every way. And those temptations pull us away from our zealousness, our commitment to Christ, where things are blunted, where they're grayed. But all of that can stop. It can stop this morning. This can be a new day for everyone. This can be a new day and week and month for this church. We are not victimized by the enemy. We don't have to be, in terms of how he pulls us away from that. Remember what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:13. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with that temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. If temptation about what is urgent is deflecting your faith, there's a way out. If you are overwhelmed at times by the wind and the earthquakes and the fires in your life, to focus on them as opposed to Christ, there's a way out. If you are tempted to settle for what is good as opposed to what is best, what is mediocre as opposed to what is good, what is tolerable as opposed to what is mediocre, there is a way out. And it really all comes down to us looking in the mirror and asking this question: what are you doing here, Christian? And I would encourage everyone in this room and anybody who might be listening online that today you take some time, you go into your bedroom or to the bathroom and you look into that mirror, and in light of what I've shared with you, you look into that mirror and you ask yourself this very question, and then be prepared to hear a whisper. Will you pray with me? Lord, thank you for this great story by Elijah. Thank you for how powerful it is, how it's instructive for us, how he was able to overcome so much evil, how he was able to confront so much that was bad, how he was still able to do so much that was good, raising people from death and providing food for people who couldn't, bringing rains back during times of drought. He would not be deterred. That's what made him great. That's why he was called by Jesus to stand on the Mount of Transfiguration, to stand next to Moses, and collectively for them to have conversation with the Son of God as the Shekinah glory. God manifesting his presence in splendor. That is our hope. Help us, we pray, for the remainder of the days that we have on this world, to be very clear about why we are here. We pray these things in your name and for your sake. Amen. Let's continue on in our worship this morning. If anybody would like to come forward and pray, you are welcome to do that. We want to use our altar more, but you are welcome to come. If it is meaningful to you to come and to pray here at the altar, if you want prayer, just let us know. We'd be glad to pray with you. So thank you.
He